The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad was released in 1949 by Walt Disney Animation and is their 11th animated feature film and the final film in the wartime era, also known as the package film era. The film is based on two stories, the first being the 1908 children's novel The Wind in the Willows and the 1820 short story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Happy Halloween, everyone! After not doing any horror-related movie reviews last October, aside for the yearly Halloween movie review, I decided to fix that. And I originally debated on even doing this review for October since it's not really much of a horror film aside for the second half of the film. But every time October comes around, I think of this movie, and it also falls right in line with my Disney reviews I've been posting monthly. And I really can't wait to talk about this film, though, because it's both one I really enjoy, and it just so happens to be the last film in the wartime era before we move on to more narrative-based Disney films. I also have a little bit of nostalgia for the second half of this film. I was introduced to The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 7th grade English class, and after reading the story, we watched the Disney animated adaptation, which is so ingrained in my head, and now when I think of the story, I think of the animated film, and I think that's what's so powerful about the Disney brand in general. But before we get into my thoughts on the film, let's do what we always do here and go behind the scenes to see just how this film was made. Shortly after the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, James Broderick and Campbell Grant pitched the idea of making a feature film on the children's book The Wind in the Willows, believing that the stories of anthropomorphic animals could only be produced in animation. To persuade Disney, they prepared a like-a-reel which combined storyboard stills with rough dialogue, but Disney seemed skeptical and found the idea corny, but acquired the rights to the story anyway, and the film was originally intended to be a single narrative rather than multiple like it ended up being. By April of 1941, work on The Wind in the Willows had begun. But after the Disney animators' strike had ended in October of 1941, the studio had to make money to pay back on a loan, which put many single-story films back on the shelf until farther notice. Production on The Wind in the Willows resumed in 1946, and by that time the film was shortened down from a feature to 25 minutes, and afterwards the film was shelved yet again. Meanwhile, Disney had started work on another animated film, an adaptation of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and soon ideas circulated about combining several stories together into package films. Initially, The Wind in the Willows was paired with The Legend of Happy Valley. However, Bongo would eventually be paired with that film, and it was finally decided that The Wind in the Willows would be paired with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And the final title of The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad was born. By March of 1948, Bing Crosby and Basil Rathbone had both signed on to provide narration to both segments of the film. The lyrics for the songs were done by Larry Morey and Ray Gilbert, while the music would be composed by Frank Churchill and Charles Wolcott, who had all worked with Disney previously in their other films. The movie was eventually released on October 5th of 1949 and made $1.62 million at the worldwide box office. The reception for the film was positive, as critics found Bing Crosby and Basil Rathbone perfect for narrating the literary works, and the film was seen as something both bright and colorful, but also dark and could be enjoyed by all ages. And though some believe The Wind in the Willows section took out a lot of the subtlety of the story, they still found it an enjoyable ride. The film has gone on to be a cult classic in the Disney canon, and the Sleepy Hollow section has also been shown many times on TV in classrooms teaching the Sleepy Hollow story. Now, with that out of the way, let's go into my thoughts on the film. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad is the closest Disney ever got during the wartime era to making a classic Disney feature film. And despite it being only 2 shorts strung together into a barely feature-length film, I think the movie stands on its own as a pretty underrated Disney classic. Also, I like how both shorts seem to complement each other while being wildly different stories in tone and presentation. It reminds me a lot of Fun and Fancy Free, which was 2 shorts put together. But I don't think either one of those stories complemented each other like The Wind in the Willows. And The Legend of Sleepy Hollow do, which is part of why I find the experience of watching this movie so much more memorable in comparison. In fact, I would say this is probably the best out of the wartime era films, although that doesn't mean it's necessarily my favorite to watch. But it's still a good film nonetheless. I think it's interesting too how many people, myself included, think of this movie during the Halloween season, despite the film not really being much of a spooky film, aside for the second half of the film. But I would also say the film has a nice, cozy fall feeling that makes it prime watching for this time of year. The Wind in the Willows is this fun, cozy little short with comedy, music, and great animation. And Legend of Sleepy Hollow brings a legendary story to life by telling the story much like you would a campfire story, which is what makes it stand out in my eyes. Both shorts have their strengths, which make them worth watching, even on their own. But I would be lying if I said I enjoyed every bit of this film. Ultimately, despite The Wind in the Willows being a good time, I find it less memorable than The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but there are parts about it that I absolutely love as well. So, let's waste no time and talk about each short in turn, starting with The Wind in the Willows. This is my least favorite of the 2 shorts, and that's not to say there's anything bad in it. Both shorts are honestly really well made, fun, but I find The Wind in the Willows to be less memorable overall, and I'm often left forgetting much of the experience by the end. I do really like the characters though. Ratty and Molly are hilarious, and at the center is the eccentric car enthusiast J. Thaddeus Toad, who is just a whole lot of fun to watch. The film is also a very complex one that maybe could have benefited from being a feature-length film, but what's here is energetic and fun, if a bit dull in some parts, and that's just due to some of my tastes as a film connoisseur. The music is great too, but we'll get more into the music when we discuss The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. There is one thing, though, I think this segment has over the other, and that is the animation. This short looks beautiful and feels closer to the quality we see in the feature film single pictures from Disney. The dark hues are colorful and bright, and it's just a finely crafted short with a lot of energy. It's just one I tend to forget about after watching because while fun, it hasn't stuck with me, and I feel it's because I don't really have a connection to the story overall. However, it's still a fine and well-crafted short that deserves some recognition for its comedy, characters, and beautiful animation. Next, we have the short that people remember most from this film, and that is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This short is brilliant, and one of my favorites that Disney has ever done, and falls perfectly in line with other shorts like Peter and the Wolf, Johnny Appleseed, and Pecos Bill. This is just a perfectly told story that manages to tell the original story in full, and despite adding some of the more whimsical Disney touches, it doesn't sacrifice any of the story's impact and is still to this day the quintessential telling of this story, which I think shows the impact of this version. It kind of reminds me of how when most people think of Robin Hood, most people will probably think of the Disney version before any other. First off, I want to briefly mention something that I love about both of these shorts, and that is the expertly done narration from both Bing Crosby and Basil Rathbone that bring a lot of elegance and commanding presences to the screen. Bing Crosby does such a good job of telling this story, and with some great animation and signature humor, you have quite the masterpiece when it comes to The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I think they also did a great job with the designs, especially with Ichabod and Brom Bones. On one side, we have this hyper-masculine man in the form of Brom Bones, who is everything Ichabod is not, who is tall and lanky and not all that attractive. But he manages to slay the most beautiful woman in Sleepy Hollow, and Brom Bones tries to take her away. It's fun and lighthearted for the early moments of the story before things begin getting much darker and sinister, and it's right here that I want to bring up the music. I think the music for The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in particular is memorable and catchy, especially the opening number, Ichabod Crane, but my favorite, and pretty much everyone's favorite, is The Headless Horseman, which is told during a party where Brom Bones reiterates the story to Ichabod to try to scare him. It's instantly catchy and filled with some great animation and movement and great gags overall. It's a song that's always in my head this time of year and is both sinister as well as cheerful. And finally, we follow that up with the film's climax, which is thrilling and honestly pretty terrifying when the Headless Horseman shows up and scares Ichabod. The animation changes so drastically, things get darker and a little spookier, and it's just perfectly crafted and quite the thrill ride, and I love the ambiguousness of if Ichabod survived his encounter with the Headless Horseman or not. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad is a fun ride. It's beautifully animated and tells two very fun stories and provides laughs as well as chills. But I think the film is weaker in its first half, but stronger in its second half. I just find The Wind in the Willows not as engaging as The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but both are great in their own way. And with all that said, I'm going to give The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad a 7 out of 10. This is a classic film. It's one I always like revisiting around this time of year, and it's a film I do remember well, but I don't think it's a perfect film, but has parts about it that are perfect. And with that, we say goodbye to the wartime era of Disney and move on to the incredible Silver Age, where some of Disney's most beloved and memorable films come out. I'm so excited to be moving forward because after several months of watching these package films, I've kind of run out of things to say about them. It's an interesting era to study, but it's not the most engaging. But there are some gems such as this film and Melody Time. But next month, we'll be moving on to one of the all-time greats, Cinderella. So, look forward to that, and also look forward to more Halloween reviews the rest of this October. Next week's review is going to be on a very underrated film from a horror master that might actually be my favorite of theirs. It's a film I've been wanting to talk about for some time now, and I can't wait to share my thoughts with you guys. But, as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.